So yeah, I'm going to jump straight into it because we've got a lot to talk about. So first of all, I'm Tom Richards, and I'm hosting this panel in my capacity as one of the co-organisers of Filmmakers for Future Wildlife, who've curated this panel in collaboration with Communicate Conference. For those of you that don't know us at FFW, we're an international grassroots organisation set up to encourage collaboration in the global wildlife filmmaking industry and help speed up the transition to a greener, more impactful and less extractive industry. In the next 45 minutes, we'll be discussing that last objective, being less extractive. I'll let our panelists define that term shortly, but first, a bit about why that's important to us at FFW. At COP26, we screened a series of films we produced about the role of wildlife filmmaking in battling the climate and biodiversity crises and ways that we felt we needed to do better to achieve that as an industry. One of those films was an interview with Kenyan conservationist and filmmaker Paula Kahumbu, who really held up a mirror to us as an industry and asked why the vast majority of international natural history documentaries filmed in Kenya, and many made here in Bristol, are by and large not available for Kenyans to watch. That collaboration with Paula made us aware of this idea that we've been being extractive, and that it's something across institutions in wildlife filmmaking, conservation, and science communication, and we've all been guilty of it. And that's something that if we really want to be truly globally collaborative in combating these crises that our planet is facing, we really need to fix. Which leads me nicely into introducing our first panelist, Pauline Kyalo. Pauline is a wildlife filmmaker who worked with Dr. Paula Kahumbu as an assistant producer in Paula's production company, Wildlife Direct in Kenya. Now she's come to the UK to study for a master's in wildlife filmmaking at UWE as part of the project Songbird, the BBC project committed to investing in developing production talent in places where the BBC frequently films. We also have with us Jane Dawson. Jane is a PhD researcher considering anti-extractive international screen production with a focus on the UK's natural history film sector. Jane's research draws on her background as a creative practitioner, and her recent work includes No California, which is a co-created documentary exploring regional labour ethics and representations of coast in the UK documentary and factual sector. Before we get into the discussion, just a quick note for those who are new to the Zoom events platform, as well as the usual chat function, which you should be familiar with, there's also a Q&A button. So feel free to post any questions in there rather than in the chat, and I'll try my best to integrate those into our conversation, and we'll have some space for Q&A at the end as well. I'm aware that myself and the panelists are all from more film backgrounds, and many of you will be from other areas of science communication, but I really feel this issue is one that spans the whole sector, wider than just filmmaking, and I think we can all learn from each other. So in that spirit of mutual learning, feel free to ask any questions or share thoughts from your own sectors, subsectors, or your own experiences too. So let's start with defining some of those terms that we're going to be discussing then. Jane, what do we mean when we talk about being extractive? That's usually a term I'd associate with something like mining rather than research or storytelling.
Thanks so much, Tom. Yes, so the term extractive, it can be understood, I guess, in lots of different ways. What I find, or what I thought might be helpful to share in this context, was a quotation from director Pamela Yates in an interview that she did for Filmmaker magazine in 2017, which was titled "Profound Communication Only Happens When There Is Persistence." When people come from the outside and take, whether it's anthropologists, academics, artists, journalists, or filmmakers, I never consider collaborating with the protagonists or replenishing what's been taken. It's exactly the same practice as extractive industries, mining, hydroelectric, or industrial agriculture. Multinational companies who steal the wealth from below the land, never share the proceeds, and in the process destroy the environment. So naturally, that's quite strong words and strong sentiment. And sometimes I think when we're talking about these phrases, it can be really easy to sort of feel like that's not me, that's not part of what I'm about or what I work towards. But realistically, we all work within systems that have been built on legacies of colonialism and imperialism, and that's gone on for decades and decades, and the legacies are still here today. So particularly in the situation of natural history filmmaking, I suppose, where it's at least the natural history filmmaking as we understand it in the global north has been built upon what academics have described quite a unique production ecology between the North Americas and the UK. This is even more embedded. So trying to be anti-extractive is something that does require a great deal of self-reflection about our roles within systems.
And Pauline, we've got this other big term that we've been starting to use, decolonisation. What does that mean to you when it comes to the way we communicate about nature?
Thanks, Tom. So for me, I think decolonization in the context of communicating nature definitely refers to dismantling and challenging the dominant narratives and perspectives and power structures that have, historically shaped how we perceive and interact with the environment. And the actions are they have to be strong, and they include acknowledging actively and rectifying the legacy that colonialism has left behind in most of the countries where these films are made and done. Because over time, what colonialism did is exploit and erase indigenous knowledge systems. And so it's definitely giving back and emphasizing values like respect and equity and inclusivity, and just actively doing that over and over until there's a good balance in how we make these films.
And there's danger with this because it's been a term that's it's been thrown around quite a lot recently. I think there's sort of conferences and public spaces that I've been in, I've seen lots of panels with decolonizing or variations of that word. We need to be wary of of whitewashing and using that word, don't we?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's one thing to say it, and it's one thing to even put it down on paper, because there's lots of people who will say, we're very keen on decolonizing and this is what we're going to do. But if it's not really backed up by actions and, co-creation and being actively inclusive with the kind of films that we're doing and the kind of research that's being done in, I'd say, mostly the global South, then it's really a word. It's just a glossy word that you can plaster on anything and on your pre-production papers. But it really has to be backed up with action and research that goes after that to say, did it work? Is it working? Who is it benefiting? Who is the voice behind the decolonization, and who's actually benefiting from it? It's not just a pat on someone's back to say, I feel good that I tried that. It's, did it actually work? And is it beneficial to people outside of myself or my production company?
And it's we need to be wary of looking at that word from a privileged point of view, I think, as well, which, like you say, the sort of meaning of that word is different depending on your sort of history and your perspective. Jane, that spans into sort of research as well, doesn't it? I mean, how do Indigenous people tend to feel about sort of research in your experience?
Yeah, so I think what Pauline was saying there about action is really, really important. So certainly in like the academic sense that I'm familiar with, decolonizing, it's considered, it's decolonizing approaches, it's decolonizing methodologies, it's doing, it's underpinned, and there are concepts within for sure, but actually it's an active process and an endeavor and a constant endeavor. So there's been a huge amount written that can help point people to understand what it means. And like you're saying, Tom, being really careful not to whitewash it. It does have quite specific meanings. And actually on the resources tab, I think there's a document which has lots of different references. If people are interested, they might want to look up to find out a bit more. But for example, Linda Tawai-Smith in her book Decolonising Methodologies, Research and Indigenous Peoples, 2006, in the introduction describes research being one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. The legacy of violence rationalised as research to Indigenous communities has been profound. So, and that's based on a huge number of case studies of Indigenous people's experience of engaging with research. So research in the scientific anthropological sense, but also it's something as well that's been replicated in communication and science communication, like wildlife filmmaking. And so I think it's really important that we sort of interrogate when we're involved in these locations and we're working with these locations, we interrogate what our process is. And certainly decolonising methodologies offers a number of different ways, and usually it's actually informed by quite specific toolkits, so quite specific actions that people should take and prompts. So for example, asking the questions the same, Linda to I. Smith says, whose research is it? Who owns it? Whose interest does it serve? Who will benefit from it? Who has designed its questions and framed its scope? Who will carry it out? Who will write it up? And how will its results be disseminated? And actually that's in an academic research sense, broadly anthropological. But I think it could be applied as well to other sectors too. And certainly there's evidence in the international documentary world of people trying to do that, particularly with, as Pauline was talking about, co-creation.
Yeah, it's interesting, that idea of ownership, isn't it? Because I think we tend to come at these things with an idea of, we develop the research and we start to go and explore that research in the field. But really we should be thinking about that ownership a bit more broadly, shouldn't we? Yeah, I mean, when we're telling stories about nature, who really owns those stories? Pauline, maybe you have some thoughts on that. What about the sort of that? How do you create that equity between us as storytellers and the people that we're telling the stories about?
You know, Tom, sometimes I think some of these answers are just as simple as ABC. It's wondering, if I made something with someone's information, who owns it? You know, and if deep down you know that you don't feel like you own it, then that's your answer. There it is. It's someone owns the information. You've gone to their country or to their region, and you've gotten all this information about a topic that probably you had no info about, and it's enriching to you. But then you have to think, did I own it? Did I come here with it? How do I feel about sharing this? And it's right down to humanity. It's, if someone is willing to share their story with me, if someone is willing to share their indigenous knowledge with me, then I think it's only fair that you become co-owners, right? And I know there's a lot of politics and bureaucracy that goes into who's paying for it, who's going to make money out of it. But those are all things that you can always come into after that first realization of, I honestly do not own this and I cannot claim ownership over this. And then we can start having conversations of, okay, what is the power dynamic here? Who's taking and who's being taken advantage of? So I think if we can be as honest and, you know, starting from the root of, I'm here, did not own this, I got it, then we can work out a way to kind of co-own, whether it's 50-50 or not, and whether it involves money or not. Because sometimes you'll find that even people are not so keen on, you know, getting all the profits that you will make from selling this to the biggest company. It's about respect, and it's about, this is my story and I'm willing to share it with you if you have respect in that sense. Yeah.
Have you experienced people sort of start to do that a bit better? I mean, what's your experience of that when you were filmmaking in Kenya?
Oh yes, I think it's definitely there. I can't speak to being around the industry for a long time, but for the few years that I've been around, people have been very respectful and are always keen to ask, you know, what's a blind spot here? What am I missing? Can you tell me? And it's not just asking, it's actually asking and implementing. And one thing that I celebrate is that the Kenyan filmmakers are also very vocal. And when they go into co-productions or when they're having a role in a big production, they'll be keen to say, this is what I think should be included. This is how I think you should treat that community that just gave you, you know, an hour-long episode, and this is what I think co-creation would look in this sense. So I think it's in both ways. I've seen a lot of people coming up and saying, I want to learn, and others saying, I want to teach you, and I want to help. So with that kind of dynamic, I think there'll be more and more co-creation opportunities and equity being achieved in the films that are being made. So yeah, definitely have seen a lot of people being open to learning and to asking.
That's great to hear. I think one of those things when we think about co-creation, and one of the sort of barriers that I've come across is that the difference in skill level. And I think we can be, wildlife filmmaking is particularly guilty of this, where we have the sort of arrogance that so much of the talent in our industry comes from Bristol or not from that place. So I wonder if you could, maybe this is a good point for you to talk a bit about Project Songbird as an example of that, and as an example of, you know, training people in the places where we want to make films and tell these stories.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's a really great effort, and I'm happy to be one of the recipients of the scholarships that have come out of Project Songbird. So some people might know what it's all about, but it's the Natural History Unit's £1 million investment over 3 years to nurture, diversify, and attract new production talent. And this is being done in countries where the BBC mostly or frequently films. So I've been lucky to be one of the two recipients of the scholarship that has been offered to two Kenyans, and it was actually open to countries bordering Kenya too, because you know the BBC films in most of the African countries around us too, and they called for applications, and I know a lot of people applied, and it was really competitive. And the scholarship was to attend the UE BBC MA in Wildlife Filmmaking, which, you know, a lot of people in Bristol have talked about as the gold standard in wildlife filmmaking. So really privileged to be part of that. So this is a 1-year program that's meant to train MAs in how to make wildlife films, you know, at a level that is up there. So that's just one of the things that is included in Project Songbird. I know that there's been lots of training in country, and also some people being flown into Bristol just to get a sense of what it takes to put together maybe a full production, work with some high level equipment, work with and collaborate with people who've been working in the industry for a longer time. Because I think a lot of us want to get in, but have no clue where to start, or what is the industry standard, or what equipment, or where to get it. So I think this is one of great steps that the BBC has taken in acknowledging that there's people outside Bristol who are really interested in making films for their countries, about their countries. And yeah, I'm really stoked to be part of it. I know Johnny Killing was the keynote yesterday, and he spoke a bit about it, but he's the mastermind behind it. And congratulations to him for actually putting something through and seeing it through. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good to see. And yeah, I know that course, being an alumni myself, teaches you a lot in a year. So it's really brilliant to see that being opened up to people more internationally. Following on from that, though, I think one of the things is, one thing teaching people within production, but you know, it also has to happen around in post-production and sort of deeper into the systems as well, doesn't it? Jane, have you seen any evidence of that in science communication?
So not so much in science communication, but certainly in terms of wildlife filmmaking, what I've noticed is, yeah, there are some really phenomenal schemes going on at the moment, and there's a lot of other ones as well that may have, like Wildstar Academy has got a short training program for underrepresented voices, which includes Indigenous peoples and women. There's some excellent schemes as well as in Africa too. But I think perhaps part of an area that hasn't really been looked at yet is like what's already there. And that's something that this morning's keynote, John Alexander mentioned, which was looking at what's already there. And there's already, in lots of different countries, there are very successful film and screen industries. So, for example, thinking about like New Zealand and Australia, there's already a huge Indigenous screen sector there that's really pioneered in terms of things like drama, horror, and other genres. And I think it can be a little bit of a protectionist approach, as you were saying, Tom, to think we are the custodians of all the skills and all the talent. And there's a lovely quote I came across yesterday, which was on the Indigenous Screen Officers website in Canada. And they said, talent is distributed evenly across the globe, opportunities are not. And I think that's what's really key. And it's useful to think about tapping into what knowledge systems are already there. So, for example, people are really focused on in-country crewing, which is brilliant. But also, like, what about post-production? There's many countries that already have really successful post-production sectors. So, for example, like Nigeria, is the industry thinking about collaborating across in those ways too? Because the editorial process and the idea of authorship, it's brilliant in wildlife filmmaking and filmmaking in general. It's actually quite evenly shared across the whole system. So having a distribution of voices across those different areas, I think, would be really useful. So there's great strides forward, but there's also more that can be done that comes from kind of I suppose, a bit more of a humble approach of going, we probably don't know, but it's probably already there. And it's like what Pauline was talking about collaboration and discussions. If you discuss with people, you'll find out, you'll get signposted.
Yeah, I think so much of it is that sort of like, merging in communities and sort of engaging properly in other communities, isn't it? I think like one thing that we've discovered in FFW as sort of part of that is engaging sort of where your distribution is as well. So getting our films seen where they're made, but it's not so, I think from our discussions, it's not so black and white as just creating a film and then getting it shown there. It has to work for that community as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, certainly on that point, like, for example, there are, if you kind of look at other forms of filmmaking in other sectors, some of them are quite established in this point, and really it's about regional and local situation. So understanding that it's not one blanket approach for every collaborator that you work with, but that different regions will have different sensitivities. So, for example, Screen Australia, if you go to their website, at the very kind of beginning page of their website is a warning, which is that says, let's see, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are advised that this website contains images, voices, and names of people who have passed. And that's appropriate for that location and the cultural sensitivities there. So I think when you're talking about things like screening films and works in country and on location, it's thinking about, well, what are the actual specific cultural sensitivities that you should be taking into consideration? Because ultimately, if we don't, then we're sort of guilty of really just continuing forms of colonization, but in an ideological way. So yeah.
It's we have to be sort of truly giving back that sort of agency, don't we, for it to be truly sort of decolonizing. Pauline, we've talked a bit before about sort of promoting collaboration and partnership. How have you seen, or how do you see us going forward with sort of meaningful collaborations between filmmakers and Indigenous knowledge holders?
I think the first step is to involve Indigenous knowledge from beginning to the end, because once it comes in the middle or somewhere towards the end, then it's really hard for it to actually have any meaning. So beginning with that in mind, and if you're going to do any work in in a setting that's outside where you come from, then you involve them from the beginning. When we talk about that dirty word research, it's what do you know, or what are you looking to know? Then who can help you from the beginning to actually communicate it correctly? So I think that's the first step when it comes to actually including Indigenous knowledge in our stories. And then the other thing is not being too stuck on the idea that you want to promote, right? When we come back to talking about who owns the narrative and who's controlling the narrative. For example, I talked to someone yesterday about it, and they said one of their best storylines is about how beautiful the Lion King is, and it's a romantic story. And I said, well, that's nice, but that's not how it is in the wild. You'd be in for a rude shock if you tried to pet a lion thinking it's Nyla or Simba and all of that. So maybe having the right idea in mind when going to make natural history, and knowing that it's okay to tell a nice story, but also, is it honest to the people who live there? We can tell beautiful stories, let's say, about elephants, but the truth about elephants for a lot of the communities in Kenya is that they're not their best friends, right? They eat their crops, and they have this tension between them. So knowing the kind of story you want to tell and being truthful to what it is on the ground, I think that helps amplify the voices back there. Because there's no need in making a beautiful film, then going back to show it to the Maasai probably of Kenya, and they're like, I don't relate to that. I don't see how cute that elephant is. I feel emotions that are not about joy and cute and all of that. So being very honest with the stories that we're telling, and also involving Indigenous knowledge from the beginning, I think that's a great way to start. And then the other thing is, as we said, training up people into storytelling. Just to lessen the frustration that comes with, having deliverables as a production company, but also being aware and awake to the fact that there's people down there whose power you need to acknowledge, going back to the power dynamics. So I think involving people and training them to know how to make a film, then having and borrowing that knowledge that they have can help us create better stories that have inclusion and better representation.
Great, yeah. To come back to your point on perspective when you're talking about the elephants, I heard a really interesting quote from a climate and humanitarian journalist that said there's a difference between getting your facts right and presenting them according to the reality of the people on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
That really showed me it's that danger of telling that single story, particularly if you're going to go down that route of making that content available in that country as well, and truly sort of create something that works for everyone.
And the world is becoming global now. There's only so much that you can hide, right? You'll make the story and someone's gonna see it, and it's just a game of catching up. So you'd rather be honest from the beginning and try and make a balanced story, which is actually very interesting. We just need to shift our mindset from this is how stories need to be to there's the truth of having a two-sided coin, and how can we balance that kind of storytelling.
Yeah, just sorry to come in on that one. I think there's very much, certainly at industry events and things like Wildscreen last year, Climate Creatives, when you hear the commissioners talk, they're often talking about the need to be really commercially competitive and astute and change things. And what kind of the traditional blue chip format of, people sitting down to watch things on a Sunday evening in front of the television, those days are very much numbered, and there are different formats, there are different audiences, and certainly the industry seems to be looking to incorporate other ways of thinking. So, for example, Darren Aronofsky, who's quite a famous kind of Hollywood director who did things like Requiem for a Dream, and The Wrestler and Black Swan. He's been involved as a producer on programs like the Territory, which is a film, and some National Geographic series too. And very much when you hear him and his collaborators talk about it, it's about bringing in different perspectives. But actually, we don't need to look necessarily to a Hollywood man who's already super established. Maybe just kind of being a little bit more open and decolonising in our approach is another way of achieving those gains.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be ultimately it needs to be prioritized earlier in the process, doesn't it? That's the thing. It can't really, so much of this is often sort of thought about halfway through a production or a process of making or producing something, or towards the end. But it needs to come from much earlier, doesn't it, really?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think once also it's open and it's out there that we want to collaborate, it's exciting the kind of opportunities or people that actually come up for that. For example, we are having drivers in Kenya be the ones at the forefront of, locating behavior, right? Leading the cameraman to where the action is, advising on where is safe to film from, where is safe to build a hide from. These are people that originally would go in and just be a driver. But the moment you come in and from the beginning, you're open to, we can create this together and I'd love to credit you in my work and I'd love to create this story about this and that. These are people who have knowledge that you would not think of even in your preparation if you're doing it from elsewhere. So that kind of openness attracts a lot of knowledge from places that you wouldn't even imagine. And who knows what else could come up, right?
Yeah, it's a really good point. Just being aware that we're sort of halfway through the 45 minutes. So just to encourage anyone to post some questions if you have them. Otherwise, we're just going to carry on the conversation. I think. Oh, there's a question. Although I recognise with a very different context, I think some of the themes might be mirrored within UK conservation issues. How we as conservationists relate and work with local communities in contentious subjects such as species reintroductions, etc. Does the panel have any thoughts on this? So yeah, I think there's quite a lot of overlap, isn't there, really, with with wildlife filmmaking, we're often engaging with conservationists, and I think you see those some of those same slightly colonial practices in conservation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a huge amount of experience of the conservation sector, but certainly when you think about, we're all part of the same systems and histories. So invariably, it's going to be paralleled in other ways. And I think there's something peculiar too about the idea of natural history, that it's sort of it's seen as a slightly separate science, but it's viewed slightly differently. And maybe there's a degree to which it's sort of been seen as like something that is undisputed and there's one version of it. And that's changing, which is really exciting, because sometimes there's the idea of science, hard science, that is one way of thinking. There is a truth and there is falsity, but actually there's lots of different interpretations, and there's Indigenous science as well, and incorporating other stories like that are really interesting ways of actually, not only is it the right thing to do, and it absolutely is morally the right thing to do, it's also giving people more opportunity to think laterally about how they engage with the natural world, and maybe sometimes it's more in keeping with what the audience's experiences too.
Yeah, and I think you can't quite separate the two, because if you ask a lot of wildlife filmmakers why they do what they do, they'll say it's because they want people to become natural conservationists. So it's to help people fall in love with nature, see the beauty, see the conflict, see all of that, and feel things that push them to actually conserve. So I don't think you can quite separate the two. So I think they definitely have to merge and mirror at some point.
Yeah, I think certainly, like we talk a lot more we're beginning to have this conversation. It's more about impact in the wildlife filmmaking sector, and I think like you can own the idea of impact is so inextricably connected to what we've been talking about. Like, is when you talk about who are the right audiences for impact, and we traditionally sort of measure our impact through sort of awareness in this sector of how many people you reach, but that's often audiences in the global north who perhaps can't really have as much impact as the people on the ground in the places where you're telling those stories. So it has to be sort of truly integrated into. We need to be co-creating with those people to be having that impact, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that was that question reminded me a bit about what we've spoken a bit about before, Jane, about Indigenous place thought, because I think conservation probably suffers from the same things that we do in wildlife filmmaking of not really understanding that concept.
Yeah, so there's a really brilliant article by Vanessa Watts, who is Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, and she talks about how Indigenous place thought can inform the way that people working with Indigenous peoples should perhaps be perceiving their collaboration. So in the article, Vanessa Watts talks about the origin stories that she's familiar with, which are very much that nature is part of her. She talks about Grandmother Sky, and she describes how she cannot be separated from nature. And to do that is actually, in her view, it's a colonial act, really, to continue to do that, because it can cause and at least encourage a cultural forgetting. And so when people are working in different locations and with different Indigenous peoples, I think it's quite important perhaps to take the time to speak to them and understand what the sensitivities are and what the histories are, and how what is being shared could actually be quite antithetical to their aim. Because I don't think anybody goes into making programs or researching with particularly Indigenous peoples with a view to do anything other than its benevolence. Sorry, someone's just said, who is that researcher? That's Vanessa Watts. It's on her article is on the resource links, but it's phenomenal. I would truly encourage you to read it. And she basically talks about how that her being part of nature, it's not a metaphor, it's not a law, it is. And it's that idea of different ways of seeing and different worldviews. And so when we're working cross-culturally, I think it's quite important to consider those. I think that's what you were getting at, Tommy. Not sure.
Yeah, exactly that. Have you seen, I'm interested to hear, have you seen any sort of examples of that being implemented well, that sort of that connection to that, and that's seen as not as separate?
I have, yeah. So actually it was through Wildscreen, which they host a number of different events and networking sessions, and they hosted a screening session last year, and through that I saw a couple of examples. One was it was a film called Mwene, which was a documentary feature, and it was made over 11 years. So it was a really long collaboration. But I would certainly recommend looking at that, because the Anita who's sort of like the focus of the story, is a young Wariani woman, and it focuses on her, but she's also one of the producers, and there was a couple of Indigenous producers involved in that from the outset. And things like just the approach to language as well is very different. So it's, the original Indigenous language is used, and it's progressive. And obviously all of these, there are many examples, and they can't kind of just be lifted and picked up for different things, because an 11-year shoot is not practical. But there are ways and there are learnings that can be brought forward. And that's what's really great about events like this, and also the events that Wildscreen hosts, is it's an opportunity for knowledge sharing and for people to kind of be surprised and get ideas and take those forward.
So following on that then to you, Pauline, have you seen any sort of examples of really sort of films or projects that you've been like, that's the way I want to work, that's sort of true co-creation in the model that we should be using going forward?
I mean, there've been a couple, but a recent one that I can remember is the Lion film, the Rise and Fall of the Mash Bride. And that's a real story that, whether shown here or shown back home in Kenya, where it was made about the big cats, it's a story that kind of totally tells the true nature of how lions are living and some of the challenges that they're facing, and the human wildlife coexistence down there. So that's a story that had some filmmakers from here, some researchers from Kenya, some experts, including my former boss, Paula Kahumbu, who featured in the show. So this is a show that for me was all-rounded, and it felt truly representative. And I know that there's many more and others that are even coming. And I think one of the other things I wanted to mention that could actually promote this kind of co-creation and great shows that can be consumed on either ends is being able to back shows that don't necessarily have to fit into a box, right? For example, going again to Paula Kahumbu, who is a great advocate for films being shown where they were made, funding projects such as Wildlife Warriors, which is one that a series that she made back home that celebrates Kenyan heroes, and all over, again, the Global South, shows that actually are for the people down there. If you have a project within your production or an arm that can actually give back in some sort of way, that's another way of decolonizing, right? It's saying, we've shown you so many films and you've gotten a way to see films that have been made for the audience here. This is how we can support you making films about your country, about your cultural experiences, and then kind of having that that kind of filmmaking done there for them, and to be co-creators in that way. It doesn't have to be, oh, if I didn't shoot this, then I didn't make it, right? You can always be a mini commissioner, a mini supporter. That's one of the many ways that we can explore when it comes to decolonizing and being less extractive. Yeah. But I'm seeing a lot of efforts. I'm seeing people that are from Kenya actually, like there's a lady that I really admire, Faith Musembi. She is a PD right now at BBC, and she's working on a great series that's going to be coming out in a couple of years. So I know that her perspectives will definitely be represented in the film, and that's one of the other ways that we can actually actively put people at the forefront of telling balanced and great stories. Yeah.
Yeah, it is great to hear some of those things starting to happen. I think we're at a really interesting time, whether it's Project Songbird, or the Wildstar Academy, or some of the interesting films that we're seeing that are starting to come out that are starting to tackle this as an issue. I think we're pretty much out of time now, so I could talk about this for hours and hours more. I know there's loads more in our sort of collective notes that we made before this that I'd love to delve deep into. But it's been really lovely chatting to you both. Thank you so much for speaking to me today and taking the time. And thanks to everyone who's been participating and sharing thoughts in the chat. Sorry we didn't have time for all the questions, but hopefully we tackled some of them. So yeah, I think the resources are in the resources tab, and you should still have access to that afterwards. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the festival. Just a last note so obviously I couldn't not tout Filmmakers Future. So if you want to connect more with us, I'll stick the website link in the resources tab as well if you want to find out more about the work we do. Yeah, enjoy the rest of your conference.
All right, thank you.
Thanks so much. Cheers, bye.